Hi everyone, Josh here again, and today we're going to be looking through article analysis. How do we find and use the best articles out there to create our own well-written essays to get us the best marks, or to submit for publication if you want to do such a thing. Let's get started. So the first thing that we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what are the components of article analysis. What are we going to look at in today's video? So what we want to do first is we want to find the correct articles. It's all well and good being able to analyze the articles that are in front of you, but if you've not found the correct ones, then that's not going to be very much help. The most important part of your research is going to be finding those good sources to use, the ones that are most relevant to what you're doing. And sometimes in our research we might miss something that's vitally important, so I'm going to talk about some general search strategies to use in order to find the good articles, because it makes it so much easier if you have a couple of great articles that are on similar topics to what you're writing about. It really does help. The only problem with finding those good articles that some students will fall into is to overuse those articles and basically try and regurgitate what that particular article has already said. Now, the thing to remember is that once you've found a good article, you need to distinguish your piece from this other work that already exists in some way, and that just helps to ensure that you're creating something new and original, and that you get to use other sources and don't just use exactly what they've used. So you want to find many good sources, but inevitably you will find a couple of key pieces. Once you've done that, you want to prioritize the best ones so that you can spend the most time reading them and understanding them and getting used to your topic. There are some that are going to be cited more, there are some that are going to be more important in your field. Now, some of that topic will be dealt with by Craig in a future podcast on evaluating sources. I think Imogen is also involved in that podcast too, so look out for that one. Once you've prioritized your sources, sorry, I think there were some motorbikes outside then. Once you've prioritized your sources, you need to determine whether those sources themselves are actually going to be useful to your project. And that might seem like that's the wrong way round, that you should decide whether they're useful and then prioritize them. But you're not always going to know very quickly. Some things take a little bit longer to work out. So create a vague hierarchy first, and then you can get rid of some of those titles if they turn out to be useless. The next thing that we're going to be looking at is whether there's actually a need to read the pieces that are there and in front of you. That sounds like a great topic, I'm sure you're thinking. Less reading, wonderful, we all like that. But it's all about kind of prioritizing your time. You only have a limited amount of it for writing your essays. So you want to be making sure that you're reading the right things and that you just know enough about the articles that are in front of you to work from. We're not expecting you to read every word of every page of every article that you find. It's all about prioritizing the data. So the kind of introduction of one particular piece of work might be very useful to you. The conclusion of another piece of work might be useful to you. One particular subchapter might be useful to you. And you just need to read those sometimes. It's useful to have an idea what the other subchapters are saying, just in case it somewhat contradicts the work in the chapter that you're citing, but you still need to know, just the chapter that you're citing sometimes. So there is a kind of methodology in working out whether you should be reading everything or not. You need to know whether the information itself is reliable once you've got it. Again, this ties in with some work that Craig and Imogen will be doing with you in some of the other podcasts. but I will talk briefly about that. Once you have read the bits that you need to know, you've decided whether that's reliable information or not, you need to know whether you can use that information within your essays. It's all well and good understanding what an author is saying, but is there a better source for explaining the same thing? Is this usable data for your work, or do you need to look elsewhere for the exact data that you want to be using? Once you've done that, obviously we need to talk about the bit that everyone loves the most, which is citations. So we will talk about citations after that, just making sure that you're citing it properly and you know what exactly you're supposed to be citing. That falls into whether the article can be used at all as well. So without further ado, let us get into our search. So first things first, finding that initial article or those initial articles. In order to even start looking for the pieces of work that you're after, you need to know what your field is. So you need to have a question that you're trying to answer, a topic that you're trying to deal with, something to go off in that respect. Now, if you're writing an answer to an essay-based question, you will have that topic in front of you. You will know what you're searching for. If you're trying to write an original piece of work like your dissertation, then you need to define what your topic is before you can have a good search. And that topic will usually be, hopefully, distinguishable as a few key words. So that could be freedom of information, very few words, good as keywords. That could be embodiment, that could be bodily integrity, that could be I don't know, fashion and laws relating to fashion. There will always be a few keywords that you can take from your subject that will give you better results. So find out what the keywords are in relation to your topic, your specific question, and write those down. Now, ideally, what you will want to do is you will want to have a fair few of these keywords because there will be synonyms for some of these words that you're using. So say if you're talking about, for example, that freedom of information topic, you might also want to look for things like freedom of expression. You might want to look for related topics to that. So free speech might be a different way of phrasing certain things in relation to that. So create synonyms for your keywords. And ideally you want to be putting that into a Word document or an Excel document. What you'll be doing with those is using variations of those words together to create your searches. So if you've already searched for freedom of information on the library search, if you make a note to yourself that you've already tried that, put a mark next to the words that you've tried in the different search engines. You won't do it again, you won't waste time. Many of us might be thinking that we have a decent memory for what we've searched, but after a few different searches, it becomes easy to search for almost identical things that you've done before. It just happens. So making a chart of what you've tried and where you've tried it is very, very useful. With that in mind, you should be using different search engines for finding those articles. Now, library search is very, very good. I would say for most of the work that you'll be doing, it's probably the best search engine that you could be using, particularly at undergrad level. Other search engines are really useful for different things, though. If you're looking at journal articles in different jurisdictions, like, for example, America, many of you will be doing some kind of comparative studies between different jurisdictions, and some of you will choose America as that different jurisdiction. Hein Online is better for finding American journal articles, for example. You might also be using Web of Knowledge, which I can't remember if the name changed from Web of Knowledge to Web of Science, or if it was Web of Science to Web of Knowledge. Either way, if you search that online, you can find that search engine as well. And that one has more of a slant towards more scientific papers, but that can be very useful. Open Door is one for grey literature, which It's less reliable than some of the other stuff that you will find on library search and things like that, but it can get you access to some sources that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get to. So use those different search engines to find those different sources and make a note of which terms that you've used. You can use the same terms that you've used, say for example freedom of information. You could use that on library search, Hein Online, Web of Knowledge, and you'll get different results each time. But just make a note that you've tried that on those different search engines and how far you've gone in those searches. So if you've gone through the first 50 results and had a look at the titles of all of those, then just make a note that you've had a look through the first 50. Because if you are struggling to find synonyms later, you might need to look beyond that first 50, but you need to remember where you got to, otherwise you will be picking up the same results again and again. There is also a huge benefit in finding, if at some point you find a journal article that deals with the topic that you're dealing with quite explicitly, or it has a special issue on your topic, then have a look through all of the articles published by that journal, either in that issue, or you could look through the entirety of their back catalogue. All of the websites for the journals will usually have a way to search through their back catalogue of articles. This is useful, but for some of the larger journals, say if you're doing one on medical ethics or medicine or something like that, and you're looking through something like the BMJ or the Lancet or one of these medical journals, they can have a huge number of back issues. So don't be trying to look through each issue individually. Instead, you want to be using their search parameters on their website to search through their journal articles, because otherwise you will be there for a long time. But some of the journals with a much shorter print run or with those special issues, you can certainly look through those issues individually, and that will really help you find some good journal articles. What you're looking for is titles that sound relevant. At this point, some of the search systems don't show you abstracts, so you won't be able to judge them, but just try and find those titles that sound like they might be relevant. Now, some of them may be a little bit tenuous, but at this point I would still recommend opening a tab with those in, or funneling those results into a folder. So library search has a function that will allow you to create a folder of your results so far. It's very useful to do that. So create all of the titles that are quite explicitly to do with your topic and the ones that are somewhat tenuously related to your topic, and create a form of data bank of those. That's where you should start off in relation to your search. Okay. The next thing to do is to prioritize the information that you have. So you've got all these different titles. You could have anywhere between just a handful, you could have like 10 different titles there, or you could end up with over 100 depending on the type of study that you're doing. At this point, you want to be kind of narrowing it down a little bit as to what you're going to be reading. So if you can, I would prioritize the different pieces that you're going to look at. So if there's any titles that sound particularly relevant, then put those to the top of your pile of the ones that you're going to look at. And if there's any that you know have been particularly well cited, or that you know are from particularly important journals, then those are going to be particularly useful. That can be a bit difficult to understand at this point whether something has been cited a lot or if it is from a particularly well-known journal. Some of the search engines will tell you how often something has been cited, and that's often a good indication of how useful they are, how important they are. The information may not be correct, but if they have hundreds of citations, that's a very good indication that they are at least important in your field and it's something that you should be discussing. Now, Craig will go over kind of determining the validity of sources a bit more in future, and I think Imogen will be talking about that as well. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, But just know that it's important to prioritize the work that you look at a little, particularly if you've got a lot of sources. If you've not got too many, it's not too much of a big deal. You can have a quick look through all of them. But if there's too many at this point, already start removing a couple of the ones that sound a bit more tenuous from your list. Okay? Now, all of us have different things that we want to be doing. I personally want to play all my lovely board games, which you can see a fair few of behind my head. But we need to read a fair amount of articles. There's just no way around it. We have to read a lot. As legal academics, it's kind of what we signed up for. We knew there'd be a lot of reading, so that's what we do. And some of these articles are long, very long. And sometimes, unfortunately, they can be a teensy bit boring. Some of them are fascinating. Some of them are not. And we don't have time to force ourselves to read every article that we come across. If all the articles are 30 pages long and we have 20 of them, then what's that, 600 pages to read? Good grief, that's a lot of stuff, even for me. No, thank you. So we need to find out what is useful for us to read and what isn't useful for us to read. Now, fortunately, that is why abstracts are invented, because abstracts tell us, in brief, what the results of that paper are. So not just what it's about, but what they conclude. That's what an abstract should be telling us. Now, sometimes a lot of students coming into the university will think that an abstract is just supposed to give us a general idea of what the paper will be talking about. But if it's a journal article, that abstract should also be telling us what it concludes. Nothing should be a surprise beyond that abstract. So have a quick read of those abstracts, because they're only, usually about 200 words long at most. And they will tell you if the paper is relevant to you. If you read that and you're unsure, then keep it to look at in more detail in a few moments. But if it doesn't sound relevant, it probably isn't, so get rid of it. You can remove that article for the time being and focus your efforts on other pieces of work. For those ones that we're a bit unsure of at this point, the best solution is to first read the conclusion. If the conclusion alludes to the kind of thing that you're trying to suggest, then read it in more detail. If it doesn't, then it's starting to look very clear that it isn't going to be useful to you. But in the interests of, there's sometimes a bit more to these articles than there appears, give it a quick skim read. Those subtitles or just some keywords that might pop up can be very useful to you. If you're looking for something incredibly specific, then use those kind of search functions that you have on most PDF software, on most internet browsers. I know on PC most of the time it's usually Control F. I think it's probably something similar on Macs. So use that keyword search when you need to. It can be very useful, particularly when somebody is saying that a particular piece says such and such a thing, and you can easily disprove that by just finding that it, what it actually says about that particular word. You can just skip to that. If you're still not seeing it after you skim read it, then obviously get rid of it. Pointless article to you at this point. So it's all about removing the topics that are useless to you. Just get rid of them. We don't have time. And keeping those remaining articles that sound like they will be useful. And as I say, those abstracts, absolutely the best way to determine that. Now, we've spoken about critical thinking in the past, and there's an element of that in choosing the right journals and using the right stuff from journals. When you found information that you like and when you're looking for information that you want to use, just give a thought to your critical thinking skills. Now, again, this is something that we'll deal with in later podcasts, but you want to be thinking about whether that data that you're using is reliable. If it isn't reliable, then you need to be clear when you're writing about it. So you'll need to make a note to yourself as to why you don't think that information is reliable. Now, a good indicator of that is always going to be from the introduction section of a paper where it's talking about the methodology and things like that. That will give you a good idea of whether their systems are going to be good enough to be used by you. But you have to judge each source on its own merits. So just remember to use those critical thinking skills as early as you can on this topic. Pretty much all articles follow a similar structure. Although they differ in terms of the content and the way that some of their ideas are framed, they follow very similar patterns to ensure that we can read them and understand them as quickly as possible. Now, as I've already mentioned, that abstract is the cheat sheet for the rest of the work, including what the piece is about and what conclusions are meant to be drawn from that particular piece of work. And that helps us determine whether we want to read any more of it or not. The authors are nice enough to realise that not everyone wants to read their weird, niche legal paper. Beyond that, all pieces will have an introduction. Now, the introduction usually serves as a means to tell the reader why this particular paper is relevant at the current time and any important historical backing for this particular paper. Has something just happened to make the information within that paper particularly relevant now? Do we need to know something in particular in order to frame the rest of the information within the paper? That all happens within the introduction. It's not trying to tell us any kind of general conclusions for the paper. At this point, it's just trying to give us that contextual backing for the paper. Why it's important, what we need to know right now to read the rest of the paper. Once you've passed that introduction, you get into the main body. Now, depending on the type of paper, this body will vary somewhat. As legal papers are generally within more of a kind of social sciences type of field, they generally move straight onto the kind of general methodology that they have chosen to express their point. So they will explain briefly in the introduction that they're going to be using a certain kind of methodology, even though they may not say methodology within it. And then in the main body, they will start to do it. This can be anything from comparative legal studies, so this legal system is different from that legal system, and this is why, and this is what we can learn from that different legal system, and this is why that works. Or it could be this is what has been decided in these cases, and this is why this is good judicial work, and this is why it's bad judicial work, and this is the kind of information that we can gain from that. It could be any type of different legal study, but they'll basically get straight into it within that main body as quick as they can, explain what has been found out in the past, and then move on to how that informs current study and current information. Now this, although it's something that doesn't express itself quite as well as the more biology, chemistry, physics type sciences explain their structure, it's still a very similar structure to pretty much any other paper. So if you look at those medical type sciences, you can see that their journals work in the sense that they will tell us a method, how they're going to get the information that they're after, the results of that experiment that they've done, and then a discussion about those results. That's not really that far from what we're doing most of the time in a legal paper. We're expressing, this is what we're doing, this is how we've got that data, this is the data that we found, and then finally telling us what that data tells us. So regardless of the journal type, you're still, in essence, getting that method, results, discussion kind of format within the main body of the text. After the body, we obviously have the conclusion. Now, the conclusion isn't meant to tell us anything particularly new, but it is supposed to summarize the main findings of the research paper. So that will kind of summarize the results of the kind of literature review that we've done, if we've done one of those, what we have determined from looking at particular cases or jurisdictions, what have you, and what conclusions we came to within our discussion. It will remind us of those. As I say, it's not trying to tell us anything particularly new. We don't want to be surprised by this conclusion, but it's supposed to be reiterating what we have found. So the conclusions can be very useful when looking at other people's work, because we can get a very quick idea of what has been determined within that body of text beyond what has been said in the abstract. And then finally, after that, we have the bibliography section. This is useful for a couple of different reasons. First of all, it helps us know where they got their information from. Was their information reliable for a start? Very similar to how you can appraise your own work, looking at your own references and things like that. But what else it can do is it can point you in directions of other useful pieces of research, articles that you may not have found within your initial study. So have a quick look through those references in any article that you think is useful and see if you can take a few of those articles and look through those. See if you can get any more useful information from that. I found many very useful pieces before through scouring other people's bibliographies and references section. So it's absolutely something that you should be doing and can do. So keep an eye on that. So if you're going to be using any of the particular papers that you found at this point, then you need to be able to explain a few things about that paper. And none of them are particularly difficult. You can find that information relatively easily. Most of this information is contained within the abstract, a little bit within the introduction, and some of the rest of it can be found within the conclusion. But if you want to appear accurate within your reporting of information from articles, then you should be able to answer the following questions that are in the PowerPoint slide. What is the article trying to show, and how are they showing it? This should most likely be in the abstract, the very least the introduction, if not. What did the article find? This will be within the abstract. If it's not, it's a rubbish abstract and probably not a great paper. How did they show that their conclusion was true? So what was their methodology in getting to that point? How did they show that this is correct? Is it just entirely unfounded? And finally, the bit that's relevant for you is how can you use those 3 points to help you make your point? Sometimes the overarching point of the paper is entirely irrelevant to the point that you're making. If it is, then you need to answer those particular 3 questions about that particular subset of information that you're trying to talk about. So, how did they show what you're saying that they showed? You should be able to answer that if you're going to use that information. If you can't, then it's questionable whether you should be making that point. Now, sometimes the reason that you can't answer that question is because they themselves are citing somebody else. Their data has come from somebody else, and in all honesty, we're probably just being a bit lazy, and we don't want to read the paper that they got the information from. This happens, and I've seen it happen in actual academic journals where people have cited somebody else because they're too lazy to go through that other paper to find where the actual initial data came from. And this can be somewhat problematic. What you should be doing is you should be following the references to the source of that information and citing that source when it's relevant to do so. Now, you can cite the initial source and you can cite the paper that you're actually reading at the time in the same citation. You can say, footnote 4, whatever footnote you're up to, the initial source of the information, reference that first of all, and then semicolon, and you can say this is further discussed in this particular article, the one that you're currently reading. And that's the most accurate kind of citation that you can give. You can show where the information originally came from, and you can talk about this person drew these kind of conclusions from that data. That will make a really solid reference. So try and do that when you can. Now, hopefully, you can answer the questions that are in this PowerPoint slide about the information that you want to cite just from the article that you're reading. If you can, it's fine. Cite the article that you're reading. No problem with that. But if you can't answer those questions, then you need to follow that data back to the source. Okay? So once you've found a piece of information that you want to talk about within your piece of work, make a note of it and make a note of the citation at the time. I know it's very awkward. I know it's a nightmare to do, but it saves a lot of time. I have not always been the most diligent in my writing down of citations as I write them. For example, when I was doing my PhD, I left a lot of those citations till later. And this left me with a couple of weeks where I was just searching for those old citations that I'd not written down properly, because you have to have them. So it took a while, and it's very, very uncomfortable to do, and it's boring, and it's much worse than just writing it down at the time. So write them down at the time. And if you think you might be using just more than that individual quote, maybe write some page references for where they talk about some other things. That just helps you find that information again later if you need to find it, if you want to start talking about something that you didn't think was initially relevant, but you might want to talk about at some point, or you think you might want to talk about at some point. So write down those references, and preferably write them down in OScholar as you go. The thing is, figuring out OScholar is initially difficult to memorize. Weirdly, particularly for articles, people seem to struggle to memorize it. But once you have memorized the system for OScholar journal articles, it's very, very easy, and it becomes super quick to write down those references. At this point, I can write down a OScholar reference incredibly fast. Don't really even need to think about it. But if you're kind of doing those later, it will take more time, and you'll end up doing it at the end of every article just to get used to doing it, and it will save you a lot more time in the long run. So in saying that, here is my example of an OScholar reference and what each bit of the OScholar reference means, because I think it's actually useful to talk about it and make you listen to some stuff about those OScholar references, because many people don't want to search OScholar online and look at what these things actually mean. Now, a lot of OScholar follows the same basic structure. Even if it's not a journal article, it will still follow a very similar structure to this. You have the author name first, and unlike some of the other citation styles, the first name goes before the last name. So my name being Joshua Warburton, in this instance, you would write my name down as Josh Warburton in the citation, or however they want to have their first name written. Then comma, then the article title itself, and this is in commas. And then after that, you have the year and the volume. Now, if you have a volume number, this is the weird bit. If you have the volume number, the brackets are circular brackets, and then you put the year within the circular brackets, then you put the volume number outside of those circular brackets. If there isn't a volume number, then it is square brackets. Bit of an awkward one. Most of the time, though, you're going to have a volume number, so circular brackets, and then volume number outside of those circular brackets. Then you have the journal title itself. Now, if it's a very famous journal, then you can abbreviate that journal title to its component letters. So Common Market Law Review is a very famous journal. You can abbreviate that to CMLR. But if it's not a famous journal, you can't do it. When in doubt, just write the entire journal title down. because most of the time I'm not expecting that you will know the difference between a famous journal and a non-famous journal. So just write down the full journal title. If you see most other people referencing it as its component letters, then you can do that. But if you've not seen a lot of other people referencing it, don't take that chance of just writing down the letters, because if it comes to the marking of it and I see letters to a journal that I don't recognize, it doesn't fill me with hope that you know that journal article, your journal title yourself. So just err on the side of caution. If in doubt, write the full title. This is the thing that a lot of people forget, is at the end of the citation, write down the first page that particular article appears on in the journal. So if it's on page 23 of the journal volume, then you write page 23. Very simple. A lot of people will just say, you know, this is the article 1, and each journal has a lot of articles in it. They don't all start on page 1 for some strange reason, because they can't all fit into page 1 naturally. So they start on different pages, so give us the page that it actually appears on. Then you can have a comma, and then you can tell us which page you're specifically referring to. So if a piece of information is from page, like the 3rd page of this particular article, then it would be on page 25 if the first page is page 23. So just kind of remember that general form, and it will make it much quicker, much easier, and you'll be able to get across to your reader much faster the information that you want to get across. So if you've taken anything from today's podcast, I hope it's that you remember to prioritize your time. Remember, you don't have infinite of it. We don't expect you to have infinite of it. So read what is relevant and get rid of what isn't relevant as soon as possible. It's very important to organize your searches and to know how that you're going to get the information that you want to get, and not repeat any of the searches that you've already done. And to use those different search engines to make sure that you get a wide array of sources. That's very, very helpful. Once you've got the articles that you want to use and you've read the information that you need to read from them, remember not to misinterpret or misrepresent the information that you're trying to give to the reader. If you can't answer some very basic questions about the information that you're trying to give to your reader, then there's a very good chance that you've not got any real basis to make that claim that you're making. So make sure you can answer those very basic questions about that information. And once you have given that information, remember to cite it properly. I know it's said 1,000 times, but if you don't cite it properly, then again, you're not going to be giving enough information to your reader to appreciate and acknowledge that the information that you're giving them is good, is worthwhile, is beneficial to them. So with those few bits of information, hopefully your journal work will be so much better and so much quicker. Thank you. See you soon.